Just as there are standard objections to utilitarianism, there are standard objections to deontology. Perhaps the most common objection is the case of the liar. One version is this. A's friend, B, is being pursued by a murderer. The friend asks A for help, and so A tells him where to hide. A short while later, the murderer approaches A and asks where B is hiding. Since A realizes that it is morally wrong to lie, he tells the murderer where B is hidden. Most people would find A's behavior unacceptable. He should lie in order to save his friend's life. Even though we have a moral duty to be honest with each other and not lie, in this case, not lying would have grave consequences. The deontologist has two different responses to this case. He could simply affirm it, that is to say, people are wrong to believe that A's behavior is unacceptable. A is morally responsible for his actions. He is not morally responsible for what the murderer does. A has done the morally correct thing, regardless of what the murderer does. A has no control over the murderer and so is not responsible for what the murderer does. The other response for the deontologist is to claim that A has other moral duties of friendship that conflict and override his duty not to lie in this case. But then we might ask, is it okay for A to tell the truth if B were not his friend? Rather than examine this response, let us consider a different case, the runaway train. A train car carrying explosives is racing down the track, apparently out of control. On its current path, it will run into a crowd of over 100 people who don't see the car coming, some of whom are on the tracks. The car is aimed to crash into some of the people, explode, and so kill everyone. A is too far away to warn the people, but A is next to a rail switch. If the switch is thrown, the car will go off to a seldom used sidetrack. Unfortunately, there is a single person on the sidetrack who would be killed if the car was diverted. A does not throw the switch since he would then be killing someone. More than 100 people therefore die. Most people would say that A should throw the switch, knowing that he will thereby kill or cause the death of the one person, but in doing so, he will have prevented the deaths of 100 people, and 100 deaths is worse than one death. The deontologist would reply that, nevertheless, killing is worse than allowing to die. But even if we agree with the deontologist at that point, the numbers do seem to matter. Killing is surely wrong, but letting 100 people die, or if that is not clear, letting 100 million people die by not killing one person seems a greater wrong. Deontology's refusal to consider consequences can lead it to embrace unacceptable consequences. The deontologist's focus on intentions rather than consequences leads to a curious doctrine that is worth examining at this point. We can illustrate it with the case of the precision bomber. It is war, and some planes are sent to bomb some weapons factories used by the enemy. Unfortunately, these factories are built near civilian residences. The pilots realize that bombing the factories will result in some civilian deaths. Since this is a just war, they are morally justified in destroying the factories, but not in killing civilians. They say, "We intend to destroy the factories. The civilian deaths are not intended. They are simply a foreseen consequence of our intentions." This case illustrates what is sometimes called the doctrine of double effect. One version of the doctrine states, "Unintended bad consequences, even if foreseen, do not make an action unethical or impermissible, as long as the bad consequences were unavoidable and the intended consequences were sufficiently good." Therefore, in the bombing raid was justified despite the civilian deaths because those deaths were not intended. Perhaps One of the most compelling uses of this doctrine is in cases of self-sacrifice. Consider the case of grenade. A live grenade is thrown into the camp. A soldier throws himself over the grenade, saving his comrades from any harm, even though he knows he will die from the exploding grenade. Let us, for the sake of argument, say that suicide is morally wrong, that we are obligated not to kill ourselves. That said, few people would claim that this soldier has committed suicide and so has violated that moral obligation. Although he saw his death as a consequence of his action, it was nonetheless an unintended consequence of his action. In this case, for many people, being an unintended though foreseen consequence makes all the difference between it being a heroic case of self-sacrifice and it being a morally objectionable case of suicide. Another use of the doctrine can be found in the justification of a right to self-defense, particularly when it involves lethal force. Suppose you are being attacked and your assailant aims to kill you. Nearly everyone believes you have a right to defend yourself, including killing your assailant before he kills you. What is the justification for that right of self-defense? You might say that the assailant is violating your right to life. True, but how does that justify your violating the assailant's right to life? Some might say that in violating your right to life, the assailant has forfeited his right to life. But how is that justified? For example, a thief violates your right of property, but that doesn't mean that the thief thereby loses the right to any property, that by stealing one thing, the thief can no longer own anything. It seems that the doctrine of double effect can provide a justification for the right to use lethal force in defending your life. Your right to self-defense gives you the right only to stop the assailant from violating your right to life. It might be the case, in the particular context, that the only way to stop the assailant is with lethal force. Your intention is to stop the assailant. The foreseen but unintended consequence is the death of the assailant. The doctrine of double effect is often invoked in cases of euthanasia. Consider the case of the terminal patient. A dying patient in extreme pain asks her physician to end her life. The physician replies it would be morally wrong to kill her. He is willing to increase her dose of morphine to relieve some of her pain, but he knows that increasing the dose will surely hasten her death. He increases the dose of morphine, and she quickly dies. According to the doctrine of double effect, the physician has not performed euthanasia, has not killed his patient, even though the physician knows that the patient's death was a consequence of his increasing the morphine dose. In short, the doctrine of double effect, in some form, is integral to the deontologist's position. A significant problem with the doctrine lies in understanding and discerning intentions. Consider the grenade case again. We said the soldier's intention was to shield his comrade from the exploding grenade, his death being a foreseen consequence of his action merely. But it seems equally plausible to say that the soldier's intention was to sacrifice himself in order to protect his comrades. How can we tell which was the soldier's intention? Indeed, the soldier himself might not have been clear, since a difference in intention might not have been in his mind under the circumstances. Nevertheless, even though we might not be absolutely certain about the soldier's intentions, does that cast any doubt over the moral assessment of what he did? It seems that in at least some cases, figuring out the intentions does not seem to matter. As we saw a couple of lectures ago, some of the cases that give utilitarians problems present no problem for the deontologist. And now we see that many of the cases that give the deontologist problems present no problem for the utilitarian. It's therefore natural to wonder whether we could combine these two ethical theories into one superior ethical theory. We'll examine that question in the next section.